Okay, so continuing where we left off, we will break down the different branches of the government. So we are on the bottom half of page 2 in your notes. Okay, there are 3 levels of government at the federal level, or 3, like in the House of Commons, there's 3 main things you need to know. First one is the executive branch, and again, keep in mind the example. What does the word execute mean? What does it mean when you execute something or a task? It means you carry it out. So the executive branch of the government, it carries out all of the laws that are passed by the legislative branch. All of these things are connected. Okay. And in the next couple of slides, we will break down how that actually happens, where laws are suggested from, and the process for that. It's also in your textbook as well. Some of you probably started looking at that. Okay. With the executive branch, you have the Prime Minister, and the Prime Minister is the head of the government. Okay. So currently our Prime Minister is Justin Trudeau, and if I understand correctly, he is in his last term. So in the next 3 to 4 years, we will likely see a new Prime Minister. Hopefully, because if he takes a 4th term, that means he did something illegal. Okay. Within the executive branch of the government, you have these cabinet ministers who are appointed by the Prime Minister, okay? So the party that wins the election, if you recall what we talked about yesterday with the constituencies, the ridings, and all the voting, the party that wins, whoever is the leader of that party becomes Prime Minister, and that person then appoints certain people to do certain tasks within Canada's governance. Okay, so what that might look like is, you know, in this setting, as a teacher, I might pick 5 of you to be classroom leaders, and I might give you certain tasks, right? So like one of the tasks could be somebody has to water salad. Another task could be somebody has to check the cell phones. Another task could be somebody has to check the current event, right? In Canada, we have, or any country, if it's properly run, there are, you know, about 15 to 30 cabinet members, and they're all responsible for certain things. And I think your textbook breaks that down a little bit more clearly. Okay, but you could have a cabinet minister for the environment, for trade, defense minister, who they're responsible for the military related decisions and protecting Canada. You could have foreign policy, which deals with events outside of Canada and what Canada is going to do. Domestic affairs, which is dealing within Canada. All types of stuff. Okay. Health, defense, finance, environment. Those are some examples there on the board. These areas are called portfolios, and the person appointed to them is called a cabinet minister. Okay, so that should cover the gist of this slide. We're going to move on. Next up, we have the legislative branch. So again, legislative, think of legislation, right? Legislation is law, it's legal stuff. So maybe the government passes new legislation. Actually, when I was in high school, the government passed legislation about making sure there was healthier snacks in school. And so partway through my high school, time in high school, you know, all of a sudden we couldn't have regular potato chips. They had to be like baked potato chips. It was just terrible. They were so gross. Okay, and then, you know, they stopped selling chocolate bars and pop, and I don't know, I think something changed. I don't know why. I don't know exactly what happened, but I know when I was in high school for about 2 years, 3 years, you know, you couldn't buy like junk food. So that's legislation. That legislation can be passed at the federal level or the provincial level or the municipal level, which is the city, right? And so I don't think that nutrition stuff was federal. I think it might have been provincial. The government of Alberta might have made a decision, right? And the thing about the legislation and the law is that, so, you know, let's say one day I'm in charge of the classroom and I make certain decisions and I say that everybody's cell phone goes in the holder. Let's say tomorrow I have a substitute teacher and the substitute teacher doesn't know that, or the substitute teacher doesn't care about the cell phone policy and they do something differently. So every time the government changes different parties or even different leaders, that leader takes the country in a new direction. And so they can change legislation, right? Like nothing is really permanent, except for maybe the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. That's a little bit more permanent, right? And the thing with the Legislative Assembly, the legislative branch, is that, they can propose a law, and we'll talk about this a little bit later, but the judicial branch, the judges, they make sure that that law doesn't break or doesn't infringe upon the rights of Canadians, right? And those rights are found in the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. Okay, so we'll move on from this slide. Okay. Oh, there's a little photo of the House of Commons. So as you can see, you have chairs, you have different tables. Unfortunately, this photo doesn't have an explanation of what all these areas are. That could be in your textbook, though. Okay, but all of these ministers and people who are elected will meet in the House of Commons to make decisions and talk about the problems associated with Canada. And I know that happened a lot during COVID, that a lot of these videos were made available. Okay, so I'll share this story. There's so the current head of the Conservative Party of Canada is a guy named Pierre Poilievre, something like that. So it's a strange French name. But there's a very popular public video of him asking the Minister of Housing, what the average home in Canada costs. And so he stands up, he says, Mr. Speaker, I would like to ask the Minister of Housing, what is the average, price of a house in Canada? And the guy responds, oh, employment is up by 5%. So they take turns standing up, sitting down, and he keeps asking the same question. Mr. Minister, or Mr. Speaker, I would like to ask this minister, what is the average price of a home in Canada? And he sits down. The guy gets back up. Oh, employment rates are going up by this percent. And he keeps asking the question wrong. So all of the proceedings, I believe, are recorded, and you can watch them, right? So you can see what the people we vote for are actually doing in the House of Commons. And so this video got quite viral because it was a bit of an embarrassment on the Liberal Party of why is this housing minister not asking the question. So Pierre had to ask him, what the cost of a home in Canada was about 5 or 6 times, and he still didn't get an answer. It's quite humorous. Within this, so we also have the Senate. Members of the Senate are, they're appointed. Members of the Senate are appointed, and they're called senators, and they play a role in the passing of legislation. Right? So anytime there's a law, it goes through the process. Eventually it gets to the Senate. The Senate reads the law as well, and they make a decision on whether or not they want to pass that law as is, or if they want to make some adjustments, make some amendments. Right? So maybe they don't like the way the law is worded. Right? So let's say the legislation of the classroom, actually the legislation of the school is that students must forfeit their cell phones into the cell phone holder. So maybe the Senate reads that and goes, no, we need to change the language because we're changing the law here. Students will forfeit their cell phones into the cell phone holder. Maybe they don't like the word forfeit, right? Maybe it's the students will have their phones taken from them, right? So the Senate can make decisions based on how they interpret the law and the language of the law, right? Okay. Prime ministers appoint senators, and obviously because it's part of the legal process of passing laws, and if you're the political party in charge, you want your laws to be passed because you don't want a vote of no confidence. You're probably going to pick senators that are supportive of you and your party. Right? It's maybe not the best practice because you want a good mix and variety of different beliefs and different backgrounds and perspectives, right? But, obviously if you want to win, you got to pick the best players to win. Okay. The Senate can propose laws but cannot propose laws that create or spend taxes. Okay. Don't necessarily need to go into that. And then there's a breakdown of how many senators we have. So again, I don't know exactly when this information was, and I would have to find updated information. But generally speaking, what we're seeing is a trend that in Ontario and Quebec, you have more representation than you do in the other provinces and territories. Now again, in Canada, we try to base things off population, and so the vast majority of Canadians do live in Ontario and Quebec. But obviously these things can change over time, and with different population levels, I imagine it would be very tough to change the laws that are associated with how this works. Okay, so just a little breakdown again, going through this. We have the House of Commons on the left, which is representation by population. Okay, actually I made a mistake on the Senate there, but we'll correct that. They're elected by their constituents, so people go in and they vote for the person running for office for a particular political party. And you can think of that as like a particular team, right? So you might have a team that supports certain things, you have another team that supports other things, and which team are you going to root for, cheer for, right? And people do that all the time with sports. At some point in people's lives, they also start doing that with politics as well, right? And obviously that point isn't necessarily in grade 9, because you're still learning and you're very young, and why would you care about this stuff, right? These people are a little bit more accountable because, you know, they're accountable to the people who voted them in. So let's say your parents really like someone who's running for a position near in Leduc, and they like their platform, so they like some of the things they're going to do, and let's say their platform is, hey, we're going to fix the roads, we're going to make sure they're clear, we're going to support local programs, like we're going to fund the LRC more. And then this person gets elected, and then 1 or 2 years goes by and the roads are still terrible and they're not getting cleared off and there's no funding for the LRC. You know, your parents can write this person a letter, they can, I don't know, maybe drop by their office, but they can decide whether or not they want to vote for this person or not the next time. And so that person could potentially lose their job if they're not doing what they said they were going to, right? They're not being held accountable, right? They also propose laws. So Senate, on the other hand, is representation by region, okay, particularly province. They're appointed, so the general population doesn't elect them, right? So again, in that classroom example, if I have 5 helpers, I pick them, right? You don't get to decide who it is. So maybe you don't like the person who is the cell phone helper because they're mean, but you don't get a choice, right? Because I picked that person. Okay. That means that that person's less accountable, so they're not accountable to you, but they will likely be accountable to me to some extent, right? The Senate also provides what's called a sober second thought. So when they look over the legislation, you have all the parliamentary people who look at it, but then you also have the Senate, and the Senate can have a wide variety of people on it, right? Because they're appointed. And so they look at the laws with a different perspective and with a different background, and the attempt is to represent the region that they come from, right? So someone in the prairies might have a different perspective than someone in the Maritimes, someone in the north, or someone from Ontario or Quebec.